next January is expected to represent a major departure from the Trump administration in policies, including international economic policies. First of all, President-elect Biden is expected to make efforts to support the rule-based order and the new American leadership on the global stage. While maintaining the current checks on China, it is likely to employ measures based on alliance and international organizations like the WTO, rather than measures such as mutually harmful tariffs. Biden administration is expected to change the U.S. environment policies, returning to Paris Agreement and declaring the goal of achieving net zero carbon emission by the year 2050. The changes in environment policies could be coupled with the changes in trade policies. Biden administration is also likely to continue to stress the reshoring of supply chains while not undermining the rule-based order. Of course, prediction is difficult at this time, as the new administration is in the early stage of formation and selecting cabinet members. Policy decisions will also be affected by changing landscape of domestic politics, including what happens in the Congress. Given the global trend of protectionism and complicated domestic politics, it is hard to predict whether the U.S. trade policy will make any major shift soon. It is also possible that trade policies may not become a priority in the face of coronavirus crisis, domestic economic problems, and other pressing issues. However, for a country like Korea, it cannot be too early to prepare for the changes in the U.S. trade policies with the coming of a new administration. The Korean economy is heavily dependent on international trade, as you know, and susceptible to changes in global economy, making it important to swiftly respond to changes in international environment, such as the changes in the U.S. government. With the inauguration of the Biden administration, Korea is likely to enjoy the improvements in the trade environment as efforts are made to reestablish rule-based order. At the same time, Korea may find itself with fewer choices on the table as the U.S. tries to strengthen its solidarity with allies to counter the Chinese effect. Korea may face a difficult situation where it has to promote cooperation with other countries in a similar position while not undermining the alliance with the U.S. It is also important for Korea to analyze the effects of the U.S. policy changes on its industries. In particular, efforts must be made to reform domestic economic structure to prepare for the stiffer international standards on labor and environment issues within new trade rules. Fortunately, Korea has already launched efforts to cope with those issues. The U.S. policy changes thus offers an opportunity rather than a threat to Korea. Particularly, Biden administration's environment-friendly stance aligns well with current Korean government's Green New Deal policy, so we can expect a great deal of cooperation in this field. We could even extend the results of the cooperation beyond the bilateral relationship between the two countries to contribute to establishing a new order in Asia Pacific in the future. Distinguished guests, the change of the U.S. government is an important event for Korea, as it is for the rest of the world. Korea can expect an overall positive effect from the election of Mr. Biden but uncertainty remains high. This conference, getting the US and Korean experts together, will serve as a valuable venue to examine the prospect of the US policies and Korea's response measures from a variety of perspectives. Once again, I would like to offer my sincere thanks to all of you for taking the time and efforts to attend the conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. And next, with a great pleasure, may I call upon Mr. Nam Ki-hong, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy and Finance of the Republic of Korea, for his congratulatory remarks via the recorded video.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am Hong Nam-ki, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy and Finance. I would like to extend my congratulations to you at the opening of the 2020 NEAC International Conference. Jimin Lee, Vice Chair of NEAC, Kim Hung-jung, President of KIEP, Kathleen Stevens, President of KEI, and Robert Zolik, Senior Fellow at Harvard University, who will be providing the keynote address. Thank you very much to you and to everyone participating in this conference. This NEAC International Conference, which is in its third year, has clearly established itself as a forum for the exchange of opinions and wisdom on not just the Korean economy, but on global economic and social issues since 2018. This conference is relevant as it considers the changes to the environment following next year's new incoming U.S. administration and is held under the theme of the next U.S. administration, the future of the global economic environment and South Korea's responses, which is very timely indeed. Distinguished guests, the unprecedented COVID-19 crisis is impacting not just the U.S. and ROK economies, but also the global economy, global trade, and multilateralism. This year, global trade is expected to decrease 10.4%, according to the IMF. Closed borders and economic lockdowns have had a huge impact on trade. To promote recovery back to pre-COVID growth levels, we desperately need a breakthrough out of the situation. Early next year, the Biden administration will enter the White House and bring about changes to the economy and trade fronts, which the international community is watching closely. There are high expectations that this will lead to decreased global uncertainty, a return to multilateralism, and improved global trade conditions, which will have a positive impact on the global economy and economic recovery. In this situation, we hope to see new waves and new energy brought to not only the Korean and U.S. economies, but the international community as well. And to that end, I would like to discuss the 4 windows of cooperation for the 2 countries. The first window is for robust bilateral trade and financial cooperation. Trade is one of those areas expected to see great changes under the new administration. Under Biden, it is expected that the global trade environment will see less uncertainty, but there will be new issues, such as in labor, environment, and human rights. Domestically in Korea, we must preemptively respond to these big changes, such as the changes in trade norms, and strengthen our bilateral trade dialogue through channels such as the Chorus FTA Joint Committee. The Korean government will continue to strengthen our financial cooperation with the U.S. and communicate closely on strengthening the global financial safety net and easing volatility in the financial markets. The second window is cooperation in technology and innovation, such as identifying new growth engines and investment cooperation. U.S. source technologies and our ICT and applied technologies can be used in various digital technologies like AI and IoT, which will be important in identifying future growth engines for both our countries. The Korean government's Korean New Deal and the U.S. Biden administration's campaign pledges coincide in many ways, and we plan to pursue key cooperative projects where these two meet. Bilateral infrastructure cooperation through mutual investments and other areas will see visible achievements due to the launch of the Biden administration. The third window is in climate change response and green cooperation in the post-COVID-19 era. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate change issue has become even more pressing. President-elect Biden has said that America will invest $5 trillion over 10 years to achieve 100% clean energy and carbon neutrality by 2050. Korea has also announced the Korean New Deal in July, which includes the Green New Deal and is worth 160 trillion won. In particular, its carbon neutrality strategy by 2050 has solidified a national vision to leap forward to an eco-friendly green economy. Through cooperation in green industries such as green cars, solar energy, and fuel cells, our two countries must lead the effort to construct an eco-friendly green society. Lastly, the fourth window is in normalizing the global system, including the recovery of multilateralism. The new U.S. administration will hopefully place importance on a multilateralist approach on global issues such as international trade and the environment. I hope that through this, we can recover the weakened global value chains and strengthen the roles of multilateral platforms such as the G20, APEC, and ASEM. Korea will also participate actively in discussions on renewing the WTO multilateral order to revitalize global trade that has been dampened by COVID-19 and reactivate the growth momentum for the global economy. Distinguished guests, it is said that the word window stems from the ancient Viking word vindauga, or the eye of the wind. These vindaugas were used to let in fresh air to old huts where humankind lived in 4000 BC. As such, I hope that there will be fresh air allowed into our bilateral cooperation with the launch of the U.S. administration, and that fresh winds will blow across the international community. I hope that through this conference, we can all have in-depth discussions on areas for bilateral cooperation and restoring trust in the international systems. I hope there'll be much exchange of wisdom. Thank you.
Insightful words from Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. Next, it is my privilege to invite Dr. Hung Jong-kim, President of Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, onto the stage for his welcoming address. Please welcome him with a big hand.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this international conference on the next U.S. administration, the future of the global economic environment, and South Korea's response. I'd like to thank Lee Jae-min, Vice Chairman of the National Economic Advisory Council, and Ambassador Catherine Stevens, President and CEO of the Korea Economic Institute of America. I also thank Deputy Prime Minister Hong Nam-ki for his recorded video message of congratulations. I wrote Bruce Jellick, former president of the World Bank Group, for his keynote speech. Dr. Chad Bowen, senior fellow at PIIE, Dr. Derek Caesars, resident scholar at AEI, Barbara Weiser, former assistant U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador for Economy and Trade, Choi Seok-young, and all participants, including everyone watching online. This year, the U.S. presidential election will be remembered as a very exceptional case, particularly in how the process of counting a vote is repeated, dramatic reversals for many days. Ultimately, the American people chose Democratic candidate Joseph Biden as the 46th president of the United States. Not only for the U.S. people, but for countries around the world, Biden will try to present a new global blueprint with the United States at the center. Thus, at this point, it's time for us to seriously consider in which direction we should build relations with the United States under the new Biden administration. First of all, the Biden administration will actively utilize a multilateral system centered on the WTO to promote the trade policies within the framework of international rules. However, the Biden administration is supposed to take measures in terms of trade policy towards China and the establishment of a supply chain centered on the United States, even though he has supported free trade. In addition, the Biden administration is said to establish an international cooperation system to rectify unfair trade practices in China, such as industrial subsidies unfair support for state-owned enterprises, and intellectual property infringement. Such a strong trade policy towards China represents the Biden administration's strategy to gain the edge in the competition for technological hegemony between the United States and China. Furthermore, the Biden administration is supposed to promote the establishment of the U.S.-centered supply chain in fields such as medical supplies, energies, semiconductors, and core raw materials that are important for national security. Restructuring global supply chain is becoming a hot topic due to the spread of COVID-19 around the world, with the United States trying to lead the global trend. Of course, the specific direction of trade policy implementation should be confirmed through the Biden administration's selection of relevant affairs. However, considering the global trend of protectionism, the global trade environment is unlikely to change significantly under the Biden administration. Considering Biden's blueprint for the United States, how should Korea respond? There is no fixed answer to this question, but a countermeasure strategy that considers Korea's national interests in each case will be needed. First of all, Korea needs to first check what the United States needs, as Biden will take a look at the U.S.-Korea alliance from the perspectives of strengthening relations with allies. For example, we can think of ways to directly participate or cooperate with Biden's emphasis on the U.S.-centered supply chain restructuring process in the fields of semiconductors, automobiles, and rechargeable batteries. Next, Biden's clean energy policy in the environmental sector is in line with Korea's Green New Deal policy, so we can expect to see various areas of cooperation. Specifically, since Korea is particularly strong in information and communication technology, it will be possible to propose a method of incorporating ICT to build a clean energy infrastructure as a cooperative model. Distinguished guests, the Trump administration internal, external policies of the past 4 years have led to increasing uncertainty around the world. In that sense, the result of this presidential election reflect American demands for the direction of the United States should move forward. And I believe Biden's new administration will make an effort to meet these expectations of the American people. In addition, not only Korea, but also non-aligned countries will see the international order be organized in accordance with the Biden's administration's stance, which will implement foreign policies based on multilateralism. Considering these points, it is time for Korea to prepare strategic countermeasures that consider national interests based on prediction of diplomatic and trade relations with the United States. I hope that the discussion of experts from both the United States and Korea at this conference will be of great help in finding ways to effectively respond to the changes in the international trade environment following the inauguration of the new Biden administration. 감사합니다.
That was a remarkable speech from the president of KIEP. Thank you. We were supposed to have another welcoming address by Ms. Kathleen Stevens. However, due to some circumstances, she will be joining us after the first session. So I'm going to introduce her later. And before we go on to the keynote speech, please allow us 5 minutes to rearrange the podium. We'll be back in 5 minutes. All the speakers, moderators, and panelists and NEAC council members to come up to the front for a photo, please. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, due to some unforeseen circumstances, we'll resume with session 1 instead of having a keynote speech now. So we'll have our keynote speech after the first session ends. So now, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin our first session. The first session is entitled The Future of U.S. Foreign Economic Policies. First, I would like to invite our moderator and panelists for session 1 onto the stage. Please welcome them with a big round of applause. For session 1, we have 2 presentations, and afterwards, 3 panelists will join for discussion. Professor Hong Yeo-han, NEAC Council Member, and Professor at Hanyang University will be moderating this session. The presentations will be given online by Dr. Chad Bone, Senior Research Fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Dr. Derek Scissors, Resident Scholar at American Enterprise Institute. This session will benefit much from 3 renowned panelists. We have Ms. Barbara Weisel, former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Southeast Asia and the Pacific, who will be joining us online. Professor Mi Kyung-yoon, NEAC Council Member and Professor at Catholic University of Korea, and Mr. Sok Young Choi, Ambassador for Economy and Trade of Republic of Korea. And let me remind you, after the discussion by panelists, the moderator will open a brief Q&A session. So, Professor Han, please begin the session when you're ready, please.
Thank you. Good morning and good evening to all the U.S. participants. I'd like to welcome all the participants here in Seoul and United States and all the listeners and the watchers around the world. Before I forget, I'd like to thank and congratulate the NEAC Foreign Economy Division for their excellent job of organizing this session. And this event was originally scheduled in the very next week of United States election. But as we became more knowledgeable of US president election system for obvious reason, and we were not certain what's going to happen even after the election, we had to postpone this event until today. So I think it was quite a wise move. But today, we are still in an uncertain, murky situation with respect to the trade policy, because evidently the new administration's priorities in the domestic economy. It's very well represented by his new appointment of the economic team. And even we don't have a very short list of who will lead the USTR in the next administrations. So, but I'm sure the transition team is writing a policy paper regarding trade policy right now. In this kind of situation, I think it is very good to have a specialist with very different perspectives. So again, I'd like to congratulate the organizing team to invite excellent speakers and commentators today. Let me introduce 2 speakers first. We have 2 excellent speakers. First, Chad Bowen from Peterson Institute of International Economics, and Derek Scissors, he's scholar in American Enterprise Institute. And for discussions, we have Barbara Weisel, the former assistant USTR, and Professor Mi Kyung-yoon. She's the council member of NEAC and the Catholic University, and Ambassador Choi Seok-young. So let me begin by inviting 2 speakers first, and I'll ask you each speaker to speak about 15 to 20 minutes. Are they here? I don't see. Okay. So, Chad, would you speak first for 15 or 20 minutes first?
I'd be happy to. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. So first, let me say thank you for the invitation to be with you. What I can start out with is I think we do now know who the U.S. Trade Representative nominee is going to actually be for President-elect Biden. It's just been reported in the last hour or so in the major media outlets here in the United States, and it looks like it's going to be Catherine Tai, who is the Chief Trade Counsel of the House Ways and Means Committee, has had that job for a number of years, was instrumental in helping to make the tweaks necessary that the Democrats especially wanted to get done in the new NAFTA agreement, the USMCA, including these new provisions on rapid response for labor and environment and dealing with concerns there. Before that, she served for a number of years as staff in the U.S. Trade Representative's office, in the General Counsel's office, and in the China Enforcement Office. And so I think she has a lot of experience litigating issues and obviously dealing with a number of the WTO concerns that have been out there for a long time with China especially. So by reputation, she is, I think, well admired, extraordinarily competent, legally sound, politically capable, and well respected. And so I think a lot of the initial reactions so far about her selection are extremely positive. And I think, you know, she has, for political purposes, you know, sort of the ability to reach out to lots of different people, which I think is a positive element as well, given how contentious politically trade is in the United States at the moment. I'm glad Barbara is joining us hopefully tonight as well. I'm sure Barbara probably worked with her quite closely at USTR, and so perhaps she can help shed some light on some of Catherine's perspectives during her engagement as well. Okay, so what I thought I would do for a couple of minutes is to, I think, talk about what some of the challenges are that President-elect Biden and the incoming administration is going to face in thinking about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, trade more generally, and the agenda that they're very much inheriting from the Trump administration. And so obviously a lot of this has to do with China. You know, that is, I think, front and center in you know, certainly the political discourse and most everything to do with trade. And I'm glad Derek is here too, because he's, you know, one of our great China experts, and he'll be able to get into the weeds on a number of different aspects. But, you know, even when we're talking about bland, boring issues like the WTO, and I say that with the greatest respect and love, since I've spent my entire career basically working on the WTO, nowadays it's all about China. And so I think where we can start is, you know, some of the initial challenges that we face, and obviously one of the core things that the Trump administration did with respect to the WTO was to stop the appointment of appellate body members, which essentially has made the WTO dispute settlement system dysfunctional. So I think there is a question about what that means for the Biden folks when they come in. Is that something that they spend time and energy attempting to fix straight away? I know there's a lot of WTO members around the world, including many of America's allies, that would like to put a priority on that, and, you know, restoring, or at least, you know, maybe minor modifications to the appellate body to get the dispute settlement system back up and running. And I think that getting some element of dispute settlement is quite important, because without it, there is this kind of overall question of, what's ultimately the value of any trade rules, let alone, any new trade rules that might be subject to negotiations if they aren't ultimately enforceable in a predictable way through dispute settlement. And so the existing situation clearly is not tenable. That being said, I think it's also important to point out that the problems the Trump administration really never really forcefully articulated, but I think there is a sort of bipartisan consensus on with the WTO and the appellate body in particular are still there. And so, dating back to the George W. Bush administration and through the Obama administration as well, again, other administrations would have taken different tactics for how to deal with this problem. But there is this concern with rulings that the WTO has made. And, Ambassador Walker in Geneva has laid out these principles for potentially fixing some of the procedural elements of dispute settlement, 90 days, getting things done quicker, and some of those concerns. But none of that really tackles what's at the heart of the underlying issue from the American side, which is rulings that have constrained the Americans' ability to use trade remedies in particular. And so here I'm talking about anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards. So, a series of rulings, whether it be on the issue of zeroing in anti-dumping cases, unforeseen developments, curtailing the Americans' ability to use Section 201 here in the United States with any great certainty, the general safeguard mechanism, or perhaps most importantly nowadays for the concerns having to deal with China, what the definition of a public body is, and can state-owned enterprises, these big Chinese firms, effectively that are upstream grant subsidies to downstream firms through, subsidized, underpriced inputs. As economists, we would say, these things are effectively subsidies, but the WTO appellate body has essentially said that no, they're not given a government function or what have you. In any case, we're at this impasse where it's more than just the procedural elements. They've actually gone quite far in a number of these rulings that those are going to need to be addressed as well. So it's not just, I think, a trivial decision by the incoming Biden administration to just start allowing the reappointment of appellate body members again. Some of these things need to get fixed. That being said, I think there is a concern about dealing with some of these issues and in relatively short order. One of the other WTO lingering issues out there is the fact that while the Trump administration didn't bring many offensive cases, right? The Biden administration is not inheriting a whole lot of potential wins at the WTO in terms of cases that it could be litigating and achieving market access opening on by getting rid of other countries' trade barriers. The Trump administration imposed a lot of policies that have been challenged at the WTO. Virtually everything it did, whether we're talking about washing machines and solar panels, obviously the China Section 301 tariffs, those can probably be put to the side. But importantly, these steel and aluminum tariffs the administration did. And looking back on this now, sort of all administrations in recent history, I guess with maybe the exception of the Obama administration to some extent, did some form of widespread protection for steel. But what was problematic for the recent administration was how it was that they did it. And the fact that they resorted to this national security law means that what's now being challenged through dispute settlement in Geneva is essentially whether or not a country has the right to, implement these kinds of trade restrictions and try to get away with it by just saying, we needed to do this to protect our national security. This is not something that you want to have the WTO have to rule on if you hope for a successful multilateral system, because it's a no-win dispute for the WTO. If they, essentially say, yes, the United States, you're allowed to do it, then that's sort of carte blanche for anybody to be able to get away with anything. And I know, obviously, South Korea has similar sorts of concerns, having filed a national security case against Japan for the export controls on chemicals for semiconductors. So it's well versed in these issues. But if, they rule against the United States and they say, the United States didn't have the right to do this, this is going to be fodder politically here in Washington for folks that are just anti-WTO, saying that, well, there you go again, overreach, and who is the WTO to tell the United States what it can and can't do to protect its national security. So this is a dispute that really needs to be dealt with, that needs to be pulled out of the system if it can, that needs to be settled before it gets to the stage of actually circulating WTO rulings on this, which are going to be lose-lose either way. And so this is a topic that the Biden administration is going to have to deal with imminently, because this is a dispute, my understanding, could come out, in relatively short order. A ruling could come out in relatively short order. But that being said, it's not easy for any politician in the United States to remove tariffs from the steel industry. We've been protecting this sector off and on in a bipartisan fashion now since the late 1960s. So this is a challenge. So I think these couple of issues, I think, have to be dealt with by the Biden administration relatively early on, even though it's said things like, we don't want to have to, we're not going to go out and negotiate trade deals relatively early, on. We're going to sort of worry about our domestic problems, the economic recession that we have right now, the pandemic, those are the priorities. Trade is not going to be a priority. But that being said, some of these issues are going to force trade to be a priority for the Biden administration, whether it wants to deal with them or not. So we've got a couple of dispute settlement issues that are going to have to be dealt with right away. I think over the longer term, obviously, what the United States is going to be thinking about with respect to the WTO more broadly is, where does the relationship with China fit in? And so one potential approach, and we sort of saw this being adopted sort of in a haphazard way by the Trump administration, or haphazard isn't the right phrase, but in a half-hearted way, maybe, by the Trump administration, was this approach put forward by the Europeans and the Japanese, which was to say, well, let's kind of work together and try to develop some new rules on industrial subsidies, forced technology transfer, the big economic, or a class of big economic concerns that we have with China, where the WTO rules are currently inadequate. And so, we had reached the stage, at least for the rules on industrial subsidies, where those three had released, a bit of text on what those might mean back in January. If my memory is correct, I think they released it perhaps the day before they released the text of the Phase 1 agreement. So it was quickly buried under the news of that. But this is something that, a Biden administration could pick up and then ultimately think about bringing into the WTO, if not and probably not in a fully multilateral way, at least as a plurilateral approach, getting all of the major players, including obviously China, to engage on these types of issues. Because I think this is ultimately what the big sort of philosophical question is. To what extent can China and the United States and sort of the market-oriented economies out there engage in a rules-based trading system together if China is not going to become market-oriented, if it's going to continue to abide by its current model? What problems are there? And obviously, state-owned enterprises, the fact that it has the system that generates subsidies, what economists would call subsidies, even though the subsidies aren't legally defined as such by the lawyers in the text of the agreement. Right. And so, when you provide export restrictions on inputs, that provides an implicit economic subsidy to your downstream firms. Right. We economists would recognize that as a subsidy, but it's not written in the legal texts as such. And this is a prominent thing that China does. When you have key input providers all throughout the economy, whether it's state-owned banks, or if we're talking about energy, or even in industries like steel, where some of the key input providers, the hot rolled steel that's utilized by all of the downstream sector, is state-owned, and can therefore provide implicit subsidies through inputs. Are these compatible? Is it compatible? Can these systems get along when you have an economy like China that is just so non-transparent, right? Admittedly, the system was not designed to be able to tackle these sorts of challenges, right? There's always sort of been the recognition that it could, but it's not clear that when you have an economy of this size, that this is really tenable over the long term. And so I think this is ultimately some of the big long-term challenges that we're going to ultimately have to be confronting. Increasingly, I think the United States obviously got there first with the Trump administration. Whether the Biden administration continues on with that approach, we'll see. I think there is increasing evidence that perhaps Europe is farther along than it was, 4 years ago, say, in terms of its willingness to engage on these issues. It's certainly not going to be willing to do what the United States has done in terms of, imposing tariffs and costs on itself in order to, set up this different negotiating starting point with China. But it does seem to be willing to engage in ways that it hadn't previously. And so I guess we're going to have to wait and see in what ways the WTO might be able to be adjusted, modified, reformed to address this kind of challenge if China is going to continue on the path that it is. And then obviously we have lots of other challenges as well that are emerging in the tech space. All of these new export controls that are being rolled out on the U.S. side on things ranging from semiconductors to software to semiconductor manufacturing equipment. We don't have multilateral ways of being able to, get other countries to take these things on board, right? And so the challenge for the WTO and multilateral trading system is we don't really have a good way of interfacing the trade stuff with the national security stuff in a coherent way. I mean, ignore steel and aluminum, but I think, arguably potentially legitimate national security concerns. There isn't really a way to deal with those in the system that can prevent them from being a constant fear of kind of bubbling up and creating giant trade conflicts, say. Okay, I think the last point that I want to make before turning it over is to say, obviously, there's an opportunity for the WTO and for the Biden administration to think very differently about public health and what the WTO can do, in response to the pandemic that really hasn't been done so far. And so, we saw obviously very, very early on in the crisis when there were shortages of personal protective equipment and ventilators and all sorts of medical supplies, countries behaved quite badly. Arguably, justifiably, there was panic and shortages everywhere. And so they acted with export restrictions. And this, sort of started implicitly with China, but, continued on when the pandemic arrived in Europe, including them imposing export restrictions on each other. So, Germany, France refused to allow PPE to go to Italy, even though when Italy was at the worst phase of the health crisis back in March. And then we saw them spill over to the United States as well through the Defense Production Act. Now, the Trump administration has shown no real interest whatsoever in thinking about the sort of trade implications of the pandemic. There are other economies that have. And so the Ottawa group has kind of put together at least minimalist proposals on what the trading system, this trade and health initiative, might do in sort of a proactive way here. This could be something that the Biden administration could pick up as well, agree to be a part of, agree to engage in the international system of vaccine distribution, right? That really ultimately is going to turn out to be a trade issue, given the fact that all of these vaccines are only going to be able to be or are only being manufactured in a handful of countries, given the nature of the technology it takes to actually physically manufacture these things. despite the fact that we have the TRIPS agreement and you can do compulsory licensing, it's not going to be the case that the very poorest countries of the world are going to be able to compel local production for vaccine manufacturers. It's just too sophisticated a process. And so trade is ultimately going to be what gets us out of the health aspects of the pandemic. And there is very much an opportunity for the WTO to help play a role in that. It needs to play a role in that, certainly in helping with the trade facilitation, especially if we're talking about some of these vaccines that require, not only logistical elements of getting them out around the world, but for some of these vaccines that require cold storage, this is orders of magnitude more challenging on the trade facilitation front than most countries have worried about and dealt with. But if and when this ultimately does happen, there's an opportunity here for the WTO, if they play a role, to be part of the solution and to receive hopefully some of the political credit that ultimately trade is going to play in helping to get us out of the pandemic. And so hopefully there is a role for the Biden administration to engage on this topic. I think in the United States, we're seeing reports that there still could be time for the Trump administration to impose an executive order that would, basically impose export controls on whatever vaccines are actually being manufactured here in the United States. And so, getting the Biden administration to take a very different approach on some of those topics and engage with the rest of the world on the facilitation of these medical goods, helping to not only stop, but restrain the use of these export restrictions, I think would be key. And so I think there's a big agenda for a Biden administration to take up along a number of different trade topics that are going to fall into their lap, even though they have said politically they're not going to want to engage on trade if they don't have to, because there's so much to do at home. I don't think, unfortunately, for them at least, politically, that they're going to have that opportunity. So there's a lot of things I think that need to be done when it comes to the trading system in the WTO, and a lot of things that they could do. And I think with that, hopefully setting the stage, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have solicited many questions beforehand. So those questions have things to do with what just Dr. Bowen had brought about just before. So to save time, I'll come back to the points that Dr. Bowen made with these questions later on. Now, let me introduce Professor Dr. Derek Sissel for the next speaker. I think he has a lot to talk about China, I think. So, Dr. Sissel, you have 15 or 20 minutes to speak. I'm sorry, I don't hear you.
We all set?
Yeah, good.
Sorry about that. I'll start by echoing what Chad said very well about Catherine at USTR. It's a very political position, and she's a very professional person. So it's a welcome nomination if it goes forward, and I hope it does. I want to talk about decoupling from China. And my argument is that we're not going to go very fast, and we're not going to go all the way, but that's the direction the US is heading in. The idea is that Xi Jinping, as General Secretary of the Communist Party, will not fundamentally alter his goals or his policy approach. It is impossible for the US to accommodate them. Certainly there will be ups and downs in the relationship and the issues will shift, but while Xi is in charge, the US is unavoidably going to back away from China economically. So the first, obvious issue for me to deal with are things going to be different in a Biden administration than under the Trump administration? And yes, certainly. There's going to be more desire for climate cooperation, which could provide a foundation for greater cooperation overall and mute some of the economic difficulties. There's going to be less hot air in a Biden administration than in a Trump administration about holding China accountable for various things, for example, by using economic policy tools like the entity list, which are actually quite weak. The Trump administration talks more than it acts on China policy, for better or worse. I think the Biden administration will do less of that. We'll have less heated rhetoric. There'll be less emphasis on the bilateral merchandise trade balance, which is President Trump's obsession, essentially. And I don't think that's constructive in the relationship. So that'll be an improvement. The phase one trade deal has not yet been dropped by either side, the US or China, Biden coming in or the Chinese government in 2021. So that might last for a while. And in general, 2021 should be calmer, certainly than the years in which the US imposed tariffs, 2018, 2019, probably calmer than this year because there won't be accusations going back and forth over the pandemic out of Wuhan. So I think the beginning of the Biden administration, you won't see immediate action, certainly towards decoupling. You may not see action 6 months in towards decoupling. However, I'm going to say that there are both non-economic and economic reasons why the Biden administration is going to get pushed towards slow decoupling, slow partial decoupling by 2023 and 2024. Let's start with the non-economic reasons, which is not the focal point of my presentation, but they're very important in US policymaking right now. In 2021, the standard Chinese practice is to make overtures to the new administration. And there'll be this implication that it was Trump that caused Xi Jinping to break Deng Xiaoping's word on intervention in Hong Kong, that it was Trump that caused China to intimidate Taiwan, that it was Trump that caused China and India to have this conflict, military conflict, small military conflict, that it was Trump that caused China to increase repression at home, to build re-education camps, create a surveillance state, and so on. But of course, that's nonsense. This is Xi Jinping consolidating his position at home so he can remain in power for an extended period and pursuing what he perceives as greatness overseas. He's been in his general secretary position for 8 years, and he would like to be, core leader for 12 more years, perhaps. He's not going to change. The U.S., again, we're in non-economic issues for the moment. The U.S. reaction to rights violations and security threats will probably intensify under a Biden administration as compared to a Trump administration, because President Trump actually doesn't care very much about national security, and he certainly doesn't care about human rights violations. I think President-elect Biden will show more interest in human rights violations. How much more we'll have to see. And another point that's very important for people overseas who may not be paying that much attention, the US Congress on a bipartisan basis, both Democrat and Republican, are more anti-China than either President Trump or President-elect Biden. We've seen that consistently in economic and non-economic legislation. So, those are the non-economic reasons, the more political reasons why I think the US is going to be pushed towards economic decoupling. I'm going to spend a little more time on the economic reasons. Xi Jinping's commitment to the state sector is not going to change after all this time. He didn't have any commitment to private sector reform when he came into office, if you had studied his record. You can see it now in his language, the lack of pro-competitive reform in China, the unnecessary mergers of already very large state-owned enterprises. That's not going to change. President Trump has been correctly, in my view, attacked for demanding export quotas from the Chinese and then not getting them fulfilled, as Chad knows very well. But the fact is that greater US exports to China through liberalization was not on the table. You weren't going to get more US exports to China through liberalization. I mentioned, because China wasn't going to liberalize, I mentioned that President Trump is sort of obsessed with the trade balance. So either we were going to get more US exports through intervention, managed quotas, or we're going to get fewer Chinese imports through heavy trade barriers on the American side. Those are really the only options if you wanted to change the bilateral trade deficit. No agreement with China. Phase one, RCEP, China, Korea, Japan, none of those agreements are going to be allowed to touch that state-owned enterprises are exempt from competition and heavily financially subsidized to expand where possible. Chad has already mentioned quite correctly that the subsidies, Chinese subsidies, are a huge issue. I would just, want to add that financial subsidies are important, but because they allow SOEs to expand in situations where other firms cannot, like in a stress caused by a pandemic. In addition to that, you're simply not allowed to compete with state-owned enterprises in a range of sectors in China, regardless of who you are, foreign or domestic Chinese private firms. And we can argue about how many sectors there are. I would say there are over 20. Some people might say there are 12 to 14. Nonetheless, you cannot have open trade with China because those sectors are not to be touched by any agreement. And that means that your agreements with China, Korea, or RCEP, or whatever, what have you, are starkly limited in their value. So there's a limitation, an economic limitation on improvements, but why will the relationship deteriorate, in my view? I don't think I've been controversial to now. This might be controversial for this audience. I don't think China is slowing. It's been slowing over the past decade economically, and I will say that it will continue to slow indefinitely. The reasons are that it is, while not yet old, it is rapidly aging. Arguably, it's aging in unprecedented fashion. It will not have a debt crisis, but it is continuing to waste huge sums of money. You can see that, for example, in Bank of International Settlement statistics on outstanding credit, which came out on Monday. It has denied land ownership to 550 million rural Chinese and kept them remarkably poor, with a government-reported income of $2,300 in 2019. So there are these huge constraints on Chinese growth: lack of participation of a large chunk of the population, a huge debt overhang at a relatively low level of income, and what is going to be an unprecedented period of aging. The party has responded to this, and I think we're all aware, by saying innovation has to drive growth, which is true. But it's a very heavy burden for innovation to drive growth in such a large economy against all those weights. And those same SOEs hurt innovation because guaranteed monopolies or oligopolies don't have any need to innovate. There's no need for the Chinese oil companies to be innovative and to find new ways to tap into shale, because they're going to be in charge of the sector no matter what, as an example. So China needs to innovate a lot. It will have some success in innovation, but it curbs itself on innovation because it requires state ownership and protection of competition in so many sectors. What that means, the limits to Chinese innovation, is that intense Chinese IP coercion, whereby they turn to firms who are dependent on the Chinese market or who want to be dependent on the Chinese market because they find it lucrative, and they say, you need to transfer IP. And of course, this is denied all the time by the Chinese, and it's denied by firms in public, but in private, it's repeated constantly. And then outright IP theft, which is increasingly being documented by the US Department of Justice. Those will continue. China may protect its own intellectual property better, but it's not going to protect other intellectual property, the intellectual property of others better, because it needs innovation more and more over time to maintain economic growth. So those are the reasons that I think the US is going to be pushed away from China. Let me describe what I consider to be US economic actions. This is a very different situation than 20 years ago. China had SOEs, state-owned enterprises, 20 years ago. They kept the Chinese market closed. But 20 years ago, it didn't matter very much to the United States and to a lot of countries around the world. Now it does. China is such a force in everybody else's market that when you look at the Chinese market and find, whatever percentage you want to call it closed, 40%, 30%, depends on how you want to measure it, it matters a lot more now. Similarly, and probably worse really because it involves military issues, when China was violating intellectual property rights 20 years ago, it wasn't taken very seriously. It was sort of annoying. At China's current level of technology, continuing to steal intellectual property is a very serious thing. It's a serious thing for core economic competitiveness for a country like Germany or Korea. It's a serious thing for national security for countries like the United States and Japan. The Biden administration is not, as a whole, in my opinion, convinced of this. I don't think the president-elect is convinced of this. I don't think some of his key advisors are convinced of it. But most congressional Democrats are. And I think over time, the Biden administration is going to be convinced of the fact that we can't allow China to continue the behavior that it's had for 20 years or more, but more intensely under Xi Jinping. And as you get towards the next congressional election and then presidential and congressional elections in 2024, there's going to be more and more pressure to show what President Biden will have accomplished on China. And he will not be able to get Xi Jinping to change and to liberalize. So what will he do? We have, in the United States, 2.5 years ago, passed new export control legislation. It's not been implemented by the Trump administration, and a really remarkable and failure. And I think it will be implemented in the Biden administration because I think the Biden administration will take the law more seriously than the Trump administration has. And so we will have export controls implemented in 2021. They won't be stringent, but the controls will be tighter than what we have now, and they will set a framework for tightening over time. It will be difficult, I think, for the Biden administration to roll back the Trump administration's aggressiveness in the Department of Justice on IP theft, especially if Senator Jones is named the Attorney General, as sometimes being discussed now, because he has a track record of being concerned about this issue. So I think on technology, we're going to get, not immediately, but fairly quickly and steadily, tighter US technology controls and actions against China. My own major issue at the moment is there's a large and growing amount of US investment into China, which has not been documented properly. I think that will happen. It will not be acceptable to US policymakers that the amount of money that seems to be going to China now through the Cayman Islands and elsewhere will continue to go to China. So we're going to get some action on US capital flow to China, which will be bitterly opposed, but the current trend is unsustainable. So it may not be rolled back, but it will be stopped. Supply chain shifts are, as Chad touched on, I don't want to put words in his mouth, are going to occur, in part just due to COVID. Countries are going to want more secure supply chains as they perceive them. Maybe they will act in WTO compliant fashion and maybe they won't. But it will also occur in part because of US distrust of Chinese supply and of Chinese distrust of US supply. I think the Biden administration will tinker with tariffs and trade barriers against China that were set up by the Trump administration. They can easily be improved upon, rationalized. The Trump administration's process didn't really make a lot of sense. It was just a race to say we're applying tariffs to a lot of products because that's what the president wanted, rather than having much rationale behind it. In any case, notable trade barriers are going to stay. And in 2022, China's import pledges under phase one will end. I don't think they will be able to negotiate a continuation. I might be wrong, but I suspect that will be the case. So conventional trade will retain the barriers, or some of the barriers of the Trump administration, and not the additional US exports. The one area that I think could get better than the last couple of years on the Trump administration is movement of people. Obviously, COVID has interrupted that, but even in 2019, it was becoming very difficult for sort of ordinary people to move back and forth between the US and China, and that may improve. But if you look at technology, conventional trade, and capital, all of those areas by 2023, 2024, I believe that the US will have separated itself in part, not in whole, certainly not, but moved away from China economically. Last thing I want to say is variations, like where could I be off? You might say there are 100 places I could be off, but I'll just give you 3. The climate change pledge that Xi Jinping made about 2060 is sort of laughably useless. He's going to be long dead by then. He'll be dead probably before serious implementation would begin. So I'm throwing that out the window, but we don't know yet whether Xi is willing to do more than that. That's a first announcement. That doesn't mean it's the last thing that he is willing to commit to. And if you can see progress from China early on in negotiations with the US and in its own actions, that's something that the Biden administration can represent as important. It can mitigate other problems that the US and China will continue to have. And it can stop the movement of that boat, that slow boat to decoupling can be stopped if there's early binding action on climate change, which is possible. We don't really know Xi's limits on climate change implementation, other than the fact that 2060 is not a real announcement. The downside scenario, the difficult scenario where decoupling speeds up dramatically, of course, is a major confrontation. And there, the obvious example is Taiwan. I'm very worried, given what happened in Hong Kong. China now has no real political appeal to Taiwan to rejoin the mainland on peaceful terms because Deng Xiaoping's promise of one country, two systems has been broken. And so I think we're going to get more Chinese coercion of Taiwan. That would be a major problem for the region and the world, and obviously accelerate the slow decoupling I'm predicting. And finally, and this is worth mentioning, and also because I like to cause trouble on these lines, if Xi Jinping were to surprisingly exit at any point in 2022 at the Party Congress or otherwise, that's not what we expect. But if that were to happen, I think a possible US-China relations reset could occur. My prediction to finish my remarks is that Xi's goals, as we've seen over 8 years, are simply incompatible on other issues, but on economic issues as well, with U.S. goals, and that will cause this decoupling to occur unevenly, over time. If Xi were to leave, the next Chinese leader, the U.S. would probably, I hope, try to reach out and say, "Are you going to be different?" And then this process could reverse. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the honest and compelling opinion on the important issue. Again, I have a question for you on the China issue. So I'll come to that after hearing from our discussant. Now, let me introduce Professor Yoon Mi-kyung first to discuss these issues. You have 7 minutes to discuss.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for both speakers for a very insightful presentation. I thought I was going to be the last to comment, and but anyway, well, Chad Brown has mentioned 3 priorities for the U.S. Incoming next administration to deal with in the trade area. And I guess I would agree with that. The dispute settlement system needs to be reformed, and U.S. needs to deal with the China issue. And both of this is critically related to the trade remedies issue, I guess. And I'm not quite sure what kind of structural or systemic changes needs to be made to dispute settlement system. That was not too clear from the presentation of Chad Brown, but it is clearly related to the trade remedy issue. And there is this trilateral initiative currently in the WTO about subsidies reform, the industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises. I guess this is targeting the China behavior. Sure if this can just be an add-on to the current existing trade remedy rules in the WTO. So I would think that we need to overhaul the existing anti-dumping and subsidies rules as well. And that's going to be quite a difficult process and messy process for even among the like-minded members of the WTO, and quite difficult to reach any agreement. And I think one of the ways the U.S. can facilitate cooperation from the friends and allies of the U.S. is to be less aggressive on applying the anti-dumping and countervailing measures against like-minded market economies. Now, ever since the restriction on zeroing, U.S. has continued to innovate new ways of finding subsidies and dumping from invoking the particular market situation clause, the input subsidies and cross subsidies, all these kinds of new techniques and legal reasonings to find subsidies and dumping. So I think a somewhat less aggressive use of this against not only China but other market economies would be helpful for U.S. to garner cooperation from friends and allies to cooperate with the U.S. in its efforts to curb Chinese competitive behavior or unfair trade practices and so on. So I would just bring up a concern if the U.S. Priority is to try and coordinate a cooperation from its allies against unfair trade practices of the U.S. This would be a core issue to deal with. And with respect to the COVID-19 and the role of the WTO, if we can do that kind of role, that would be very welcome. So that's what is the most important thing I would mention about Chad Bound's presentation. What Derek Caesars have proposed as seems to be a qualitatively different kind of an approach compared to a WTO reform approach that Chad has mentioned, because this is a strategy that does not expect any reformist reactions from China. So I think this would mean quite, I'm not sure it can really be a partial decoupling. It is a way to be quite completely decoupled from China. It is a way of cutting off trade relations rather than trying to go back to the multilateral negotiation forum. And so I think it is important to distinguish between multilateral cooperation approach and this decoupling approach. I have doubts about how practical some of the tools that Derek has mentioned would work. But one of the things that he mentioned is restructuring the supply chain. And as he pointed out, on the export side, that would not very much harm the U.S. economy, but most of the cost will fall on its allies in East Asia. And from the perspective of Korea, I think this is a concern. So I think I would accept that we should share in the cost of maintaining a trade system that is not distorted. But if the cost falls disproportionately on some countries, I think there needs to be some offsetting factors. And I hope the incoming administration would take that into consideration. I wonder how the China would respond to the decoupling kind of strategy. I'm not sure if China will fall so quickly as Derek might expect, because I think Chinese economic system is somewhat different from the old Soviet type of socialist system. And China has seemed to have reached a certain threshold of technological development that it will be happy to go on its own independent path of development. So perhaps that's going to be a more costly or difficult choice to be made on the part of U.S. allies on how to cooperate with this kind of strategy. So whether there will be some offsetting factors or not would be an important issue for Korea, I guess. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jung. Now, Ambassador Sheikh, you have the floor. 7 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Han. First of all, I thank for the presentations, and I also welcome a good news and Catherine Tai, who would lead the USTR in next US administration. Actually, we look forward to the leadership of United States in international trade. Regarding Chad Bones' presentation, I think he aptly captured four trade-related policy priorities of U.S. new administration. I just conceptualize his presentation with 4 R's. One is revitalize the U.S. economy. Second is reset allies to define common interest. And third is re-engage WTO. And lastly, rationalize export control regimes. First, I just would like to discuss with WTO issues. We have heard a number of WTO reform agendas and proposals. And U.S. Biden administration had expressed actually in his policy platform that WTO reform is one of the priorities. And dispute settlement system, appellate body issues, and then trade remedy questions are all the priority areas of Biden administration's interest in WTO reform. Now, again, actually, the China question is involved in this area. State-owned enterprises is combined with industrial subsidies. And Chad, actually, you talked that these subsidy questions and the non-market economic status or state-owned enterprises issues can be handled in WTO in multilateral forums, including China. But if China would be included, can United States achieve the high level of ambition what U.S. initially thought? And if not, the level would be lower down. The agreement may not happen. That would not meet the expectations of the United States. Therefore, actually, to what extent the U.S. and China can cooperate on this matter in the WTO context? That is my first question to you. And my second comment and question is that I welcome the Biden administration's actually intention to reset with allies to define common interest. Actually, in order to do so, we have to rebuild the trust between the countries, between the allies. However, I think I totally agree with that directions. However, Biden administration should also focus the revitalization of domestic economy in the beginning. Therefore, he has to spend most of his energies and resources in the first year of 2020 and 2021. And 2022 is also another election year. Therefore, he also has to devote for domestic affairs. And then trade agenda can naturally become a back burner, as a lower priority comparing with the national domestic economic agenda. Therefore, my question is actually when and how the U.S. new administration to work together with allies to define common interest in the area of trade. Actually, against this backdrop, European Union a couple of days ago unveiled a new transatlantic agenda for global changes. European Union articulated 4 areas of potential cooperation between EU and United States. Number 1 is climate change and COVID and trade, technology, and then China questions, etc., etc. Likewise, many Asian allies of United States, including Korea, also expressed how United States would come up with the trans-Pacific corporations. But we still don't know actually the details of the cooperative schemes of United States under new administration. My second and the next issues to make comment is that the export control issues. I agree that to rationalize the increasingly expensive U.S. export control regime, and that's to make it more multilateral. It is quite natural, actually. The export control regime has been developed separate from multilateral trading system. They have their own actual regimes developed, and most of export control regimes are voluntary. It's not actually mandatory regimes. Therefore, like-minded countries can work together in export control regimes. Therefore, Chad, actually, my question is, if U.S. new administration's intention on export control regime would be multilateral, then what exactly multilateral means? Is it the multilateral of the like-minded countries? Then if so, China would also confront with this kind of development, which may be led by the United States. This is also linked with also Derek's presentation. If under that situation, the export control regime by United States, and then potential countermeasures to be adopted by China on export control regime may collide each other, then U.S. can handle China on its own. But what about U.S. allies? We already witnessed the situation of escalating confrontation between United States and Australia, since Australia leaning to the U.S. position. Then actually the confrontation between U.S. and China would ask U.S. allies to pick and choose a very difficult decisions. Therefore, actually, my question is that what would be the U.S. position under these situations? And lastly, this is also another China issue. In fact, between U.S. and China, there is a wide spectrum of issues of cooperation and confrontation. U.S. may cooperate in trade and investment areas with China, but still some frictions on SOEs and subsidies and other issues. And there are also harder issues such as human rights questions, and also South China Sea issues and Taiwan issues, etc., etc. However, on the other hand, there are areas that both countries should cooperate each other, such as climate change and COVID issues. Under this situation, what kind of means, credible means, the U.S. government would have to work together with China while actually managing the potential confrontational areas? That is also my last comments on Chad. May I have 1 minute on Derek's comment? 30 seconds, yes. Right. And Derek's comment, actually, I have a great sympathy on Derek's presentations. And again, U.S. may leaning to partial decoupling against China, then Chinese response may be China, in order to overcome the U.S. intention to decoupling, China would like to be independent. As we already have seen, China already declared that the dual circulation economy would be pursued. While capitalizing a bigger market in Chinese domestic market, China will boost up domestic consumptions at the same time reaching out to foreign countries. Can U.S. intention, this partial decoupling, would work under these circumstances? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now we have Barbara Weiser online finally. So I'd like to give floor to Barbara Weiser, but In addition to your prepared comments, I'd like to ask you to talk about Catherine Tai as a candidate for USTR. I suppose she is somewhere between political appointment and specialist appointment. So please tell us about her when you make a statement. Is she online now? Okay. Hi. You have 10 minutes to speak. I don't hear you. Can you check your audio?
Okay. So, can you hear me? Thank you very much for including me in today's session. It's a real honor to be here with you and with the excellent speakers. On Catherine Tai, I will add my voice to the consensus of the others that she is an outstanding choice. She has experience both in USTR and in Congress on a variety of issues. As Chad said, she had worked to help ensure the passage of USMCA, and she has worked very deeply on issues related to China. She is also held in high regard by both Democrats and Republicans on the Hill, as you could tell from the support that she received for her nomination, or before there was news of her nomination, there was quite a bit of chatter about it, and she had support from many on the Hill. And I think that the fact that she has accomplished what she had while on the Hill and also at USTR, where she worked in the General Counsel's office on a range of issues, but most prominently on China-related issues, I think all of that will position her very well to make meaningful progress on the issues that are going to be on Biden's trade agenda. So I think an excellent choice. And I expect her nomination to go through smoothly if the announcement is made tomorrow as expected. Let me also give some responses to the remarks by Chad and Derek. And also I was asked to offer a few comments on how the US may respond to the conclusion of RCEP and CPTPP. So I want to reserve a couple of minutes for that. On Chad's remarks on trade priorities for the Biden administration, I would like to discuss these, but sort of in reverse order and recast them a little, because I think it's important to understand how the comments that he made fit into the trade policy approach that the Biden administration's most likely going to take. He's been very clear, as Chad pointed out, that his immediate priorities will be the COVID response and rebuilding the domestic economy, his Build Back Better agenda. And that will focus on a lot of the issues that both Chad and Derek talked about, which are clean energy, climate, digital economy, and responding to COVID. And then he's also made clear that his priority will be rebuilding alliances. He feels that U.S. leadership abroad has suffered over the last 4 years, so that will be a priority. On China, he's been very clear that he wants to deal with tech issues, on state mercantilism and other issues with allies and partners. So as both Chad and Derek said, I think those will be important. So in the first instance, I think it's important to think about the WTO and what he may do on the WTO and other trade issues, looking at trade policy in service of these domestic and foreign policy goals, rather than sort of as a standalone. And maybe that's what Chad, you were intending to do, but I just wanted to make that point clear, that it will be not so much subordinated to domestic policy, but integrated into it more fully, so it's not siloed. So as you think about some of the issues that were raised, rethinking supply chains or China policy, I think the administration will be looking at those issues as part of the domestic policy. So what does that mean on supply chains? Well, I think it means that even wherever the fora are that this is going to be discussed, Biden administration will understand that there are vulnerabilities in the supply chain. They've talked about bringing supply chains back home. You know, maybe what they'll be looking at is bringing some supply chains home, but building trusted supply chains, not within the WTO framework, but with a limited number of like-minded countries that can agree to specific rules that will guide those trusted supply chains, say transparency or accountability or reciprocity or whatever the countries agree to, but that it would not necessarily be something done in the WTO context. As I forgot who pointed out already, there are understandings that some countries have reached already on these issues, and those can be built on. And I think you know, there are starts that have been made by many countries. There are also countries looking at ways to deal with China's rise. And so when you think about what will the Biden administration do and how does this fit in, you know, the Biden administration has talked about R&D as it guides its sort of industrial policy, if you think of that as an industrial policy. But even here, the Biden administration has talked about R&D as part of a more comprehensive strategy to advance U.S. competitive interests and build strength and job growth, and not so much as a defensive policy solely to counter China. And I think that's appropriate. I think we need to think about what we're doing as ways to advance U.S. economic interest and not solely to counter China. On the reset with allies, I think Biden has made clear that things are not they're not picking up where the Obama administration left things 4 years ago. Things have moved on since then. And I think given the closeness of the election, there are a lot of foreign governments that are going to have doubts about whether there's durability to U.S. engagement. So I think even as the Biden administration will want to move deliberately on trade, as both speakers said, I think that Biden will not look to any free trade negotiations, either bilateral or regional in the near term. He'll work to reset relations. He'll direct his campaign, his administration to resolve trade irritants and to try to build this coalition of democracies to advance his broader agenda. I agree that he will not eliminate tariffs, even with economic allies in the beginning. He won't drop the phase 1 commitments. I think Derek said that. I don't think he'll do that. Even though he understands they've been self-defeating, I just don't think he has the political, politically he'll be able to do that. And even on the 232 tariffs, I think he understands that that's not helpful to rebuilding relationships, but he won't be able to he won't be able to add swiftly. He'll have to find ways to broaden exclusions and deal with this issue over time. So getting to the WTO issues, on re-engagement with the WTO, I think that the Biden administration understands that it's really important to get to rebuilding the rules-based trading system. It has suffered in large part because of positions that the U.S. has taken, and I think they understand that and they want to reassert the U.S. role. They do have to get past the decision of a new WTO Director General. We'll see how quickly that happens. And I expect countries to want to work with the United States, but as has been laid out, and I agree completely, there's a lot of really complicated issues here, and it's going to be difficult to move this process quickly. There are trade disputes that are lingering. I think the administration will try to resolve them or slow the process. So they have time to resolve them, but they are going to require attention. And I think on negotiations under WTO auspices, I think it'll move slowly, but there are negotiations that have been started and are underway, including on the digital economy. And the Biden administration may see those as valuable to continue so that there's some negotiating going on in the WTO. And it may even be that some of the climate change work can move to the WTO, but I think it'll be slow. On Derek's comments on decoupling, I just want to sort of I think there's a compelling case that he's made and important points. I wanted to sort of make a semantic point, and that is that I think it's really important when we consider these, as I was mentioning earlier, that the steps that the U.S. is taking that might lead to decoupling be thought of as measures to promote U.S. competitiveness and to promote reciprocity and fairness and our common economic interests that we have with our allies, rather than to think strictly of them as decoupling. And Derek, I know that's not what you were doing, but I just think that if there's going to be space for cooperation with China on climate change or any other issues, we need to talk about this differently so that we create that space. On some of the specifics that Derek mentioned on import measures to stop Chinese unreasonable discriminatory trade practices, on subsidies in particular, I think clearly these should not be focused on the trade deficit. I think the Biden administration understands that fully. And the impact of Chinese subsidies on competition in U.S. and other market economies is something that's really important and has been looked at by a lot of countries. There was work that started, as was mentioned, between the U.S. and the EU and Japan, and I think that can be built on. I would also mention that in TPP, we looked at how to deal with some of these issues as it relates to SOEs. There are some important progress that was made there in terms of things like, what do you do about the lack of information that you have about country subsidies and subsidies by SOEs, and some approaches that we came up with in TPP that I think are useful to look at and maybe even build upon. On export controls, just sort of a framing comment here on Derek's points is that, I think the Biden administration will look at what was done and ways to continue to make progress. I think they may see more of a high wall, small yard approach as being more appropriate and maybe more effective in addressing the concerns that we have. And just on a point on investment, the U.S. and other countries have pressed China over many, many years, and as part of even the Trump administration negotiations, to eliminate investment barriers. And, the EU is now trying to conclude a bilateral investment treaty that would eliminate investment barriers. So as the Biden administration thinks about how to reconcile the approach of pushing China forward to open its market with whatever else they might want to do to discourage investment in China, including, let's say, portfolio investment, I think those are going to need to be reconciled. Those are important questions.
One more minute.
Okay, let me just then wrap up by talking about TPP and RCEP, or TPP and RCEP. On RCEP, just to be brief, I think there's no chance that the Biden administration will pursue any effort to join RCEP. Its standards, its approach are too different from the US approach, and so I don't think it will be of interest. Rejoining TPP is a framework, I think, more aligned with the US approach, and Biden was a strong supporter of TPP when he was vice president. I think he probably saw withdrawing from the agreement as a strategic blunder. But he'll want to conduct a domestic policy review to consider what trade agreements will look like. Trade promotion authority is expiring July 1st, so he'll have no choice but to do that. But in the meantime, I think all of these other discussions and cooperation with all of the allies and partners on the issues that we've been discussing, supply chains, maybe digital governance, climate-related issues, investment subsidies, all of those are things on which small groups of countries may come together. And then if there is an opportunity to put all of that back into a TPP or some other comprehensive agreement, I think that may be the way to do it. So I'm out of time and I'm going to stop there, but thanks again for including me.
Thank you very much. We have less than 20 minutes for this session. I'll spend these 20 minutes to present the questions we received beforehand. I chose one question each to every yes. I have 3 questions. Extended, they are all in Korean, and one question to each U.S. participants. This is in Korean. I will read it in Korean because we have excellent translator, and I hope they can convey my Busan accent for our American colleagues to enjoy. Okay, one for systems.
So if the US goes with not carrots and not sticks, but with decoupling, that means that you're leaving the decision up to the allies to follow suit or not. And this means that the allies would have no choice but to follow this US bloc. So, and this also can be interpreted as saying that the US is going to give a threat to the allies, giving sticks instead. So using 5G bidding as a way of using these sticks to Japan, for example. This decoupling is going to mean the other countries, other economies would all going to be followed in. And so do you think that you're going to do what Xi Jinping is doing to try to really bully your allies?
Should I answer now? Okay. So this also, there was a decoupling question earlier. I'll try to answer them both briefly. Yeah, you know, if the U.S. is pushed by, and this is my opinion, Xi Jinping's policies towards this decoupling and some of our own domestic political issues, it's going to put allies in some difficult positions, as was mentioned by both the first 2 commentators correctly. I agree with their points. There has been some bullying on 5G by the United States. I am not privy to why this is such an important issue. It doesn't seem that important to me. I would emphasize semiconductors, for example, over telecom. You know, the fundamental choice here is the United States, you know, for countries like Korea who are involved in the supply chain as intermediate suppliers, we are not obligated, and I'll be blunt, to have a supply chain that runs through your country. So when the United States is looking to decouple, hopefully we make rational, clear decisions that we telegraph to our friends. That has not been the case oftentimes in the Trump administration. I would love improvement on that score. Hopefully we talk to our allies. But if the US wants to shift supply chains or otherwise decouple, countries are going to have to make choices. I would say, I'll try to be brief in this answer because I know we have a lot of other questions. If military technology is involved, then I think heavy U.S. pressure, and if you want to call it bullying, I hope we don't bully, but heavy U.S. pressure is appropriate. because having American servicemen and women be threatened by technology leaks from our allies is not acceptable. When military technology is not involved, I hope the U.S. Does not go with reshoring and everything has to be done here and cuts our allies out forcibly. And I'll give a concrete illustration. There's a semiconductor bill that is now through the Congress, although the funding of it is still in question. And there was a debate in that bill about whether, what's the allowable foreign participation? We do not want Chinese participation in the making of advanced semiconductors, but what's the allowable foreign participation? And my, what I advocated for and what a lot of people have advocated for is openness to that. So that in semiconductors, we are trying to make sure China does not achieve, as possible, advanced capabilities in semiconductors. And we would want our allies to come along with us, but of course our allies should be able to participate fully. It should not be a case of funding only US manufacturers and creating some wall. So, my answer is in military technology, there's going to be difficult choices for our friends. This is the decision the United States needs to make for itself. Elsewhere, I hope the United States will be much more willing to talk to our allies. I think we'll get that out of a Biden administration because in the Trump administration, as I mentioned, everything got reduced to, are we running a bilateral trade deficit with you? Then we need to block your exports to our country. I don't think that will be true in a Biden administration. So there are going to be some unavoidable tensions in decoupling. It's easier for the U.S. to decouple from China than it is for our friends to decouple. But I think there are some issues where we can work together. And I hope that answered the question and the part of the earlier question.
Thank you very much. Next question is to Dr. Bowen. It's in Korean again. WTO
So there are complaints against WTO appellate body. I think the complaint has already been with the previous administration, not just the Trump administration, especially the Obama administration actually stopped the retaking of the term for the appellate body. So do you think that there's going to be a new blueprint for that, or do you think there's just going to be a legacy inherited from the previous administration?
Jurisdiction of the WTO, whether it is judiciary process or arbitration process. So, Dr. Bowen, you have 30 minutes to respond to this question.
Great. Maybe I'll try to combine it as well. And so I love talking to Korean audience and experts because inevitably it always comes back to trade remedies. And this is what I've spent a big chunk of my career researching and studying. And there's just such great expertise there. So, yeah, I mean, this is the concern, and it's not just even Obama administration's concern. This dates back, to the Bush administration. All of these rulings that went against the United States' use of trade remedies. So anti-dumping in particular is where it started on the zeroing decisions. As an economist, I look at this and I say, this is absolutely ridiculous. These are tiny trade policies in terms of how much trade that they impact on the United States side. Now, from the South Korean side, of course, it's actually disproportionately important for South Korean exporters, and that just happens to be because of the particular products that South Korea is bundled into. So I can understand why, from a South Korean side, this is important economically. But for whatever reason, politically in the United States, this is one of our red lines, it seems, with Congress. And so it's sort of, you can continue to poke the bear with the United States in trying to chip away at our use of anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards. But when you do that, it has repercussions. And the repercussions are we start to use things like national security tariffs to protect steel instead of anti-dumping and countervail. And then, if that's not enough, we'll take away the ability to use dispute settlement to challenge us and to get these things removed after a couple of years on time, right? These are just so politically sensitive in the United States. And so I think this is what the rest of the world has to confront. This is what, unfortunately, I as an economist have had to confront. None of these laws make any economic sense in terms of you can't look at them rationally and say, the anti-dumping law sort of makes good economic sense. So we should, and so looking at it through the legal prism, I don't think is particularly useful either. You just sort of have to recognize this as a political necessity, an escape clause for the United States to have really low tariffs, to be open, in everywhere else that it is. I think this is just how we have to think about that. So the question for the rest of the world is, are you willing to sort of grant the United States increased access to these types of tools in order to get the appellate body or some sort of functioning dispute settlement back? Did you want me to respond to sort of the other questions that had come up, or just to leave it at that question for
We
you?
have 2 more minutes to speak.
Okay, so let me take a minute to maybe address some of the other ones in particular. So working with allies, and so first of all, let me say I thank you, Barbara, for clarifying my remarks. I went right into the WTO stuff, but I agree entirely. The Biden administration has said we're going to focus at home. Trade is going to be sort of complementary, and she articulated that very well. I agree. Working with allies, I think that yes, the Europeans have mentioned, I didn't say it enough, the Biden administration has said they want to do things on climate. That could mean, working with what a European approach is going to be on border carbon adjustment, since the Europeans seem to be going ahead on that. The Europeans Trade and Technology Council approach that the ambassador mentioned in their statement of last week, their document they rolled out last week. So that's a potential approach there, in addition to the trilateral that has been mentioned. The last one that I wanted to mention is just this issue on export controls and what I mean by this. So let's talk specifically about what the Trump administration has done on export controls, and take a firm like Samsung. When they first put export controls on American semiconductors, stopping them from getting access or stopping Huawei from getting access to them, those didn't work because we don't actually manufacture semiconductors in the United States anymore. Even American semiconductors are largely fabricated in, say, Taiwan. And so it created opportunities for firms like Samsung to supply to Huawei instead. So instead of implementing export controls on a multilateral basis, working with the South Korean government, what the US administration did was they went to Samsung and said, you can no longer buy American equipment to be able to make any semiconductors at all if you want to sell those semiconductors to Huawei. So you effectively are going to you're going to feel the wrath of American export controls, you the firm. And what I would say is, from a governance perspective, that's going to be tricky at some point for the South Korean government. Maybe it's easier for the South Korean government right now, not being confronted by China and saying, look, the Trump administration did this. We don't have any say in it whatsoever. But at some point, this is going to cut off markets for some of these firms. And presumably in a democratic society, they're going to come to the government and say, this is imposing costs on us. Why aren't you doing something to protect us? In any case, I don't think this is a sustainable long run approach. There needs to be a new sort of international framework to deal with export controls in a multilateral, like-minded way that gives other governments input into the process. And we're just a long way off, I think, from getting there. So I think that's what I meant to say is sort of the challenges that still lay ahead of us on that front.
Okay, thank you very much. One final question to Barbara Weinstein. It's in Korean again. 바이든 정부는
So Biden is more focused on domestic issues. His slogan was actually build back better. So it appears that this administration is going to focus more on domestic issues rather than external economic issues. And so from other countries' point of view, that might still seem like a repeat of the Trump administration. Of course, this might be a little bit different in the Congress, but if the Senate remains Republican, then do you still think that the external economic policies under Biden will be very fundamentally different from under Trump?
Yes, I do think they'll be fundamentally different. I mean, I think that Biden has a different approach to dealing with allies. He believes that the U.S. needs to rebuild its leadership, as I said. And I think even if the focus is on rebuilding the domestic economy, the administration will have to figure out how to walk and chew gum at the same time. That is, even though the priority will be on the domestic set of issues and rebuilding the U.S. economy, they will have to very directly and quickly begin rebuilding ties with key allies. And I think that they've signaled that already. They will begin to start negotiations. I think they'll try to get ambassadors in place very quickly. Not all of that has to be done by the president himself. He will have a strong team of people who can carry out his agenda. So I think that he will be able to do that. The other thing is that I think he has been very clear that he wants to cooperate with allies. So even as he's rebuilding the domestic agenda, whether that involves measures to deal with, as I said, supply chains or digital economy and building the digital economy, or on dealing with these China issues, doing that in a way that involves cooperation with our allies, I think they will understand is really important and will be much more effective if they do that.
Thank you very much. As usual, I'm pretty much pressured by the time constraint, but I'm obliged to give at least 1 minute to our Korean colleagues. Ambassador? And anyone? Okay? Okay.
Okay, I will take 1 minute. Okay, yeah, this is just 1 minute. I just would like to make 2 points. One is that we really look forward to the return and credible leadership in international trade by the United States. And secondly, as the speakers and commentators mentioned, that the trade agenda may become a relatively lower priority compared with the domestic economic issues. And also there's some congressional issues like the TPA questions in the United States. However, the trade is a very important agenda for the bilateral relations between US and US allies. Therefore, we need to listen to the clear signal of the United States new administration on the directions of US trade policies. I think the nomination of next USTR with Catherine Tai is, I think, it's a good news and a good signal, but we need to have more details of the policy directions of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As upcoming event is waiting, we have to conclude this session. But before I end, I'd like to express my deepest thanks to the panelists for sharing their insight and opinions and information also. I look forward to have another event like this, maybe sometimes in the January. So thank you. Thank you all the participants and our listeners. The session is concluded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, esteemed speakers, panelists, and moderator. Okay, then, ladies and gentlemen, as promised, let us proceed now to our keynote speech. The keynote speech will be delivered online by Mr. Robert Zoellick, former president of the World Bank Group and U.S. Trade Representative. His presentation is entitled The Political Economy of Trade 2021, and this presentation will be followed by a brief Q&A session. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Zoellick with a big hand.
Thank you. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, first, I apologize. I was given a slightly different time for coming on, but I was fortunate to be able to hear the panel and get the benefit of their wisdom to you. And so I will try to build on some of the points they mentioned, but also perhaps set them in a slightly larger context. And I want to begin by thanking you for the privilege of speaking to the National Economic Advisory Council. The Republic of Korea really has been one of the world's great success stories in the late 20th and early 21st century as a vibrant democracy through your economic growth and dynamism, and in recent decades as an increasingly influential regional and global actor. And you've accomplished all this while suffering the division of your land with a dangerous communist totalitarian regime within a Northeast Asian region that has been the cockpit of strife through the eras of both empires and modern nation states. So I especially respect Korea's efforts to anticipate and reflect on the situation today. Modern Korea, at least in the South, is in many ways an exemplar of the age of globalization. So I understand your anxiety about the future of globalization. I think the simple assertions about globalization's decline can be very misleading. In fact, the phenomena of globalization are vibrant, even intensifying. Consider pandemics and biological security, climate and environmental topics, data and capital flows, as well as the other economic interconnections, plus the security topics such as proliferation and terrorism. But it's the governance of globalization, the rules, the standards, the norms, the processes and expectations that have been weakening, fragmenting, and even leaving the system adrift. So today, I'll begin with some observations on the context of these tensions in the trade arena. Then I'll offer some hypotheses on what to expect from US policy in the Biden administration. And I'll conclude with some suggestions for Korea to consider. So I'll begin with observations about changes in the trading system. As Koreans know well, the world of trade is always dynamic. It's always changing. So even before President Trump changed US trade policies and before COVID, we were witnessing changes in the trade winds. Since the global financial crisis, manufacturing trade had slowed, but the services trade had been booming ahead. Supply chains were becoming less reliant on labor cost arbitrage and more on digital platforms. Changing technologies were also starting to change these systems, especially with the potential of 3D manufacturing and printing. Regional patterns were also changing, especially in East Asia. Many of these were driven by China's shifts, increased domestic demand, the development of internal supply chains, and moves towards greater intermediate goods, and as you discussed so far, the big Chinese investment in technology. You could also see the increasing fragmentation of the internet and demands for data nationalization and localization. And these changes required adjustment in trade infrastructure, what I'll call the infrastructure of trade, ranging from shipping to ports to different platforms. But even more, and this will be the key point I'll emphasize for you, we need to upgrade the software of trade, the rules, the codes, the systemic designs. Now, past US presidents across different administrations, the practice had been to try to adapt the systemic rules and capacities to changes. So past policy looked to governments, international institutions, but also the role of the private sector. And we saw this in areas such as services, intellectual property rights, environment and labor standards, technology, and the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement was a good representative of this sort of modern type of agreement. Now, Trump, as you know well, and as Derek mentioned, took a very drastically different approach. He declared in his inauguration that he was a protectionist, and so he was. The first protectionist president we've had since Herbert Hoover in 1929 to 33. He focused on bilateral trade deficits. He preferred managed trade deals and restrictions, purchase packages, and not framing new rules. And frankly, he was more interested in the old economy than the new. Now, Korea, to its credit, managed this shift as well as any other country. And that relied on some skillful negotiators, and also the support of US friends who valued the security and political ties, as well as the business arrangements. US relations with China, in contrast, have been in free fall. Chad's work really sets the standard on this, but the first phase trade purchasing package has been falling far short. And then when COVID threatened Trump's reelection, his administration turned to a full-fledged confrontation and spasmodic decoupling. But it's important to recognize that China has been changing too. When President Xi took control in 2012, his top priority was to revive the Chinese Communist Party because he saw that it was weakened by corruption, cynicism, and even in his terms, indiscipline. One story that brings this home to me was that Xi created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union and ordered all the party cadres to see it in 2012. Now, if you'd created, this was a film about the end of the Cold War. And if you'd created such a film in Europe, it would have highlighted Gorbachev as the hero that helped end the Cold War in Europe. But the Chinese version was quite different. Gorbachev was the fool that abandoned the Communist Party, led the breakup and ruin of his country, and the not so subtle message is, it won't happen here. I had a small experience of my own in this regard. I had worked closely on China's reform agenda when at the World Bank. In 2012, right before Xi took power, we prepared something called the China 2030 agenda with the Development Research Center. And so I had known Xi actually when he was party secretary in Hangzhou. He visited me in the United States. I visited him in Hangzhou. I saw him sometimes when he was vice president. And so I asked him after he became president, what were his priorities? Because we both could have discussed large aspects of the economic agenda. And his answer was very striking. He said, it's the 86.68 million members of the Communist Party. And I remember because the numbers were transversed. So I think that number now is probably closer to 90 million. Now, I dealt with a lot of prime ministers and presidents and chancellors. I'm not sure any others that I'd asked about their priorities for economic development would have talked about their membership in their party. But I think that was a clear sign of the direction that Xi was headed. Now we've seen the effects of this: stronger party control, stronger centralized economic controls, less space for internal debate, greater reliance on state-owned enterprises, really more challenges to China's private sector. And then I think another subtle aspect is there's a greater fear of giving bad news to Beijing, as we saw with the early stage of the COVID-19 breakout from Wuhan, where people were afraid to report bad news up. Now, of course, Xi is framing the dual circulation theme, which will guide the development of the next 5-year plan in 2021. To me, this seems like a reaction to both pandemic and U.S. decoupling. It focuses on greater self-reliance. We'll see greater vertical integration in domestic industries, perhaps a shift from some of the consumer to industrial interests, particularly in the internet and technology sector, 5G cloud data centers, upgrade cities and traditional industries, smart grids, new infrastructure, stronger semiconductor design, and focus on universities and technology. But China will also want to supplement it with foreign investment and technology. And this you see with the RCEP, Premier Lee's comments about possibly having free trade agreements with Japan and Korea, the ups and downs of Belt and Road, and even sometimes a flirtation with the TPP. So I think we're going to face many questions about how the balances will be struck. So as your advisory group looks to the future, I think this will be a key area to recognize and to try to watch as we learn more about China's decisions. Now, while recognizing the importance of China's economy to Korea and the region, I think it's important to be careful to recognize that China's view of interdependence is not just economic. Beijing wants the economic leverage to deter foreign pressure. And having fought hard for Korea's independence over the course of a century, I think Korea can best secure its independence by multiplying its regional and global linkages. Now, looking beyond China, let's consider the world economy in 2021. Personally, I expect an acceleration of recent trends and disruptions, especially in the digital and technology world, which if there's one point I want to emphasize, that will be a key area for you to focus on. We're going to see big variations by sector. We'll see consolidation in some sectors, particularly the energy sector. I would expect that more labor will become tradable services. The buildup of debt will increase the risks of solvency problems and restructuring for both countries and companies. Expect calls to build back better, as you heard it from the panel, especially for the green economy and various stakeholder interests. Importantly, I think with many of the companies with which I work, I see a priority on the focus on talent, a worldwide talent search with increased competition. And both companies and governments will need to build trust, because I think we've seen over the past few years a general lack of confidence in governments, in companies, in global institutions. And that is important, whether it's customers, clients, investors, regulators, societies, and it's not easy to regain that trust once it's lost. Yet this expected future of disruptions brings us back to the issue that I began with of governance. Who will make the new rules for trade and the digital economy? It doesn't give me any pleasure, but I think you have to be prepared for more fragmentation and divergence. You have to be prepared for a world of multiple rules. I would expect to see some regional adaptations. I worked a lot with Singapore over the years. I serve on the board of Temasek, one of their sovereign wealth funds. And I can see that Singapore is already looking to see how it can move from being a port city to a platform city. It's trying to explore cross-border digital platforms. And I think you're going to see this in carbon and other fields as well. Now, let me turn next to what we might expect from the Biden administration. And I think you've got a pretty good review from the panel. But the point that I would start with is always recall that the incoming administration faces a staggering set of challenges at home. It's got a persistent pandemic, and a frayed healthcare system, and the success of this administration will depend heavily on the vaccine rollout. And you can see that with some of the people they've appointed as coordinators, Jeff Zients in particular, who is a well-regarded person from the Obama administration in the business sector. There's an uncertain economic recovery with the vulnerable falling behind. Although personally, I think with the vaccine rollout, if there's additional stimulus packages, that the economy could come back rather well in 2021. There's immigration frustrations, there's calls for action on climate and the environment, and there's racial tensions. That's a very big agenda for an incoming president. I suspect, but we'll find out in January, that the Republicans will control the Senate. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party is still angry because of its dashed expectations for political control. Now, in this environment, Biden's past experience in the Senate could help him with negotiations and compromises. But this will take a lot of time. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind with the focus of an incoming administration. Now, Biden has extensive international ties and interests, but his time and political capital may be limited. He stressed a more multilateral approach to international issues, in part to sharpen the contrast with Trump politically. But most of the specifics of his multilateralism are pretty fuzzy. I think the most likely possibilities will be that he will seek to connect the administration's domestic agenda with its international plans. And you can see this most clearly in the area of climate change, where appointing former Secretary of State John Kerry means you have a very senior figure, an activist, a person that professionally was a peer of Biden. And that means there's a larger challenge, however, for the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor will be to integrate climate with other foreign policy issues. And that'll be an important challenge to watch. You're also likely to see the focus on international efforts to overcome the pandemic. This should include more than the current pandemic, because what virologists are understanding is that we're seeing increasing frequency and economic costs of the breakout of these viruses. It's a direct function of the expansion of livestock with wildlife and zoonotic viruses. There's a lot of research that could be done to prepare for these circumstances. Korea obviously learned a lot from past virus outbreaks in terms of dealing with this one. But I think this will be a larger challenge for the United States and international partners, including those in Asia. Now, international economic policy should be part of this domestic international agenda, but I think the plans are somewhat unclear. The Federal Reserve has performed quite well, including with early use of dollar swap lines. I know from discussions over the years with people in Korea's central banking system, this is actually a very important relation for you to have, and one that you'll want to make sure you keep that special status. I think Janet Yellen appreciates the international connectivity, but her concentration is likely to be more domestic. My own view is the United States should be working more closely with international financial institutions such as the IMF, World Bank, and regional development banks, which have become critical players on climate or biological security issues. So that brings us to the big question mark of trade. And you've heard some good views on this. My own view is the Biden White House will continue to be sensitive to some of the protectionist constituencies that you see in the Democratic Party. What's interesting is the polls show that Democratic voters are increasingly becoming more trade, more so than Republican voters, but that might have partly been a response to Trump. It may also be sort of younger voters. And the traditional constituencies in the union movement are still going to be wary of trade at a time that Biden has a lot of political issues to handle with the Congress on other issues. I believe he'll probably stop the blatant misuse of tariffs, sort of the blunt protectionism. But as I think Barbara Weisel and others mentioned, he'll be cautious on sort of lifting these. Now, I actually think there's an opportunity. There's a ray of hope here. Actually, I'm just writing a piece that looks like it'll be published on Friday in the Wall Street Journal to try to build a new pro-trade coalition. And I think Chad emphasized some of this. It would probably focus first on some of the environmental goods and services, health supplies, and importantly, the digital economy. And then it would connect with ongoing efforts, for example, in agriculture, which is important to U.S. trade politics, intellectual property rights, services, possibly new attention to labor issues coming out of the USMCA agreement might offer a basis for lessening labor opposition. But as many countries know, there'll be the anxiety of whether this becomes a new form of protectionism. I think a critical issue to watch will be how the new administration implements the USMCA in Mexico, because with the opportunity to bring cases against individual companies, this could become a way to reform labor institutions in Mexico, which is something very much needed, or it could become an excuse for protectionism. If the Biden administration takes the approach of Obama's first term, it'll actually be too slow. And I think the US will fall behind, because I think particularly in Asia, we've seen that regardless of what the US thinks about trade, the rest of the world will move ahead to face these larger contextual challenges that I mentioned. It was interesting to see in Obama's second term, he realized this, in part because he saw, I know from one of his close advisors told me that he showed the trade statistics about Korea, and he saw how the US was falling behind compared to China. And he realized this was important for America's sort of Asian presence. And that's what led the administration to focus on the TPP. But frankly, if they'd got it done a year earlier, it would have passed the Congress, because the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, actually passed the Trade Promotion Authority. So it's where timing is quite important in the politics of trade. But I also want to highlight the digital transformation in particular. I think the Biden administration is likely to convene a group of democracies to address technological security issues, some of the ones which you were talking about with the panel. But I hope, and I want to try to urge them to look beyond the security issues to the design of a digital economy. What I find so striking in this pandemic is how digital tools are driving advanced manufacturing, retail and e-commerce, remote health and learning processes, entertainment, financial and payment services, cloud-enabled business software. This is going to be the driving transformation over the next decade for all our economies. And frankly, we need rules on cross-border data transfers, free choice of technology. Governments shouldn't create customs barriers or compel technology transfers. At the same time, we need to protect copyrights and patents. Yet, and this will be the challenge, in some ways it's like the old trade agenda 70, 80 years ago. You need to create a framework for the movement and use of data, but give sovereignties freedom to be able to establish terms for privacy, security that meet their political needs. But one way or another, these will be the core issues for trade policy in the 21st century. Now, the Biden administration will probably proceed cautiously in the WTO. And here you got some good advice from the panel. And as I think some of you noted, you have to recall the Obama administration actually began the process of blocking appellate appointments, although they changed that actually with the Korean nominee Hyun Kim, which, by the way, some of us had a word with Mike Froman to make the case. So it shows how the personal relationships matter here. I think they may seek procedural and transparency improvements within the dispute settlement understanding. You talked a little bit about the unfair trade practices, the anti-dumping and countervailing duty ones. I would personally focus attention on another one. I think it would be helpful if WTO rules, especially for safeguards, created more flexibility for political safety valves. What Chad Bowen was basically telling you is you can complain about these unfair trade practices, but the politics will drive them in the United States and perhaps many other economies, frankly, because our traditional protections or for traditional sectors are relatively low. And so you need a political safety valve. I personally believed a safeguard approach would be better because it was more time limited, it was more transparent. But Pascal Lamy and I both agreed that the interpretations of the safeguard provisions were rather strict. That may be an area to try to deal with the politics while not creating some of the economic violations that Chad mentioned from anti-dumping and countervailing duty. In a very practical way, the WTO needs to show progress. Success breeds success. The WTO is at serious risk of just being pushed to the periphery, even if it's only modest steps, whether they be areas like fishery subsidies or dealing with export bans for food or health supplies. Some of my friends have suggested a removal of nuisance tariffs, all tariffs below 3%. Here, I'd combine the political practicality with the policy to show that the WTO is back in the game of influencing trade. Over time, there'll be other changes needed, particularly the flexibility for liberalizing coalitions to agree in mutual steps, whether this is like the old GATT codes that were used after the Tokyo round. As you discussed, there will be a need to address state subsidies through state-owned enterprises. As Barbara Weisel mentioned, we actually started to do this back with the U.S. free trade agreement with Singapore and over 20 years ago, and the TPP explored this. And so I don't think there's a sort of magic solution here. If you think about the challenges of state aid, all one has to realize it's one of the issues that's hanging up the Brexit negotiations. So it's not easy, but definitely given the reliance in China on state-owned enterprises, even though they're efficient, this will be an issue that the United States and other participants will have to come to grips with. And then there's the abuse of issues like the special and differential treatment. I'm not sure it would make sense to address that head on. I admire Korea's willingness to sort of cede this issue. I think it's probably better to address it issue by issue, including through plurilateral agreements. And over time, Fred Bergston and others have made suggestions about how to deal with exchange rate manipulation. And as I think Chad mentioned, we're going to have to prepare for carbon border taxes because the climate issue and carbon will move forward in domestic economies, and one will have to deal with the trade implications of that, although I realize it's not an easy issue. And one will also then need to connect the regional integration, which I emphasized, with the global systems and rules. So let me close with some suggestions for Korea to consider. I began by referencing Korea's success as a democracy, your story of economic development, your world-class companies, and also one could add Korea's becoming a soft power standout with culture, music, dance, entertainment. And I think the Republic of Korea's effectiveness in dealing with COVID-19 is a lot to be proud of. It's really shown how democratic governance can offer effective governance in crisis. I'm very pleased to see Korea's success, although I know there's work to go. I also saw, whether in the US government or at the World Bank, how Korea showed initiative in the G20, in APEC, with the international financial institutions, and with the high quality free trade agreement with the United States. So as I step back, I think the bigger picture is that the world faces a tension now between forces of autarky and adaptation. And these will be important in dealing with some of the transnational issues I mentioned, whether economics or climate or biological security or data, as well as the security challenges. And I think what you'll see with the Biden administration, and you got a little bit of sense of this from your panel discussion, is while the administration, I don't think has it all worked out, they will want to start to try to work on some of these issues with their allies and close partners, because that's the way that they'll lay the foundation for their two biggest foreign policy challenges, which is the future of free societies and China's power. Now, at times when under stress, Korea has sought security by building barriers. That would be a huge mistake. As my own country has struggled to relearn, our strength comes from our openness, not through walls. We need to remain open to ideas, to goods, to capital, to people, because openness prods innovation, adaptation, and resilience. Korea, as a democratic partner in both economics and security, can especially encourage U.S. leaders and the public to recognize America's self-interest in pressing forward on these trade and international economic issues. With the Biden administration, I think Korea would also be able to build political capital by leading on climate issues, emissions reductions, technology innovations, efficiencies, perhaps carbon absorption and storage issues. Korea is certainly well positioned to assist with lessons learned and monitoring and research in planning for future biological security issues. So as I look ahead to 2021, I think this is going to continue to be a year of competitive disruption, technological disruption, and even ongoing social disruptions. And what I've observed from my readings of history is that adversity often reveals and accelerates the hidden weaknesses. But disruptions can create opportunities too. And if there's any country that I would point to, Korea has repeatedly turned adversity into its advantage through innovation. And at least when the United States has performed well, that's our tradition too. So we both need to stay on that track. Thanks, and I'd be pleased to try to address any of your questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Zolik, for your insightful speech. Now, I have some interesting questions to you that have been passed on to me from several experts on the field, but quite unfortunately, we cannot present all these questions given the time constraint. So before I introduce one or two of them, let me take some questions from the floor, both on-site and online. So if there's anyone with questions, please raise your hand or turn on your microphone and speak in Zoom. Yes, sir. Could you hand over the microphone to the...
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. Excellent presentations for the prospect of trade policies in 2021. I have one quick question. Last week, on the occasion of APEC meeting, President Xi of China expressed China's intention to consider joining CPTPP if circumstances would be satisfied. Is it just a political rhetoric, or do you think that China is really serious in joining CPTPP? Then if so, if it is the case, then China must change the current economic system, including subsidies and also state-owned enterprises, et cetera. Thank you.
Well, I think your question points in the direction of the answer. And I think it reflects the tension that I mentioned, which is all of you know Chinese history very well here. And you know that there's always a historical tradition of self-sufficiency in China. And I think under Deng Xiaoping, that was radically changed. But in the combination of US policies and COVID, I think you've seen an effort under Xi to step back to that self-sufficiency with his dual circulation. At the same time, their technocratic advisors understand that a withdrawal from the international economy would be disastrous for China. And so I think you see these statements and, for example, their role with the RCEP and their talk about TPP or trade with Korea and China or and Japan. And frankly, I would like to see a U.S. administration that resumes its partnerships with Korea, Japan, others in the region, and tests the seriousness of China's behavior. I take a lot of Derek's points, and I've mentioned my own about the direction I think the Chinese economy has gone. But in the practical work, beyond the sloganeering, I think one can try to push China to recognize reforms that are in its interest as well as the international interest. And I'll give you two examples. At least from what I've been able to understand, China's creation of intellectual property rights courts, which is something the United States and others pushed, those courts are now finding for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. And maybe a little different from Derek's view, at least my understanding from the surveys of the US Chamber and the European Chamber, intellectual property rights issues are evolving as an issue, as you would expect as China gets stronger. Doesn't mean one can be complacent. It means one needs to stress the importance of serious penalties. So rather than do the market purchasing agreement that Trump did, I would focus on an issue like that. Or, for example, the forced technology transfer, which is clearly prohibited by their WTO accession agreement, has been a problem. Companies are afraid to bring in the evidence. My guess, a lot of this stems from the joint venture requirements. So if China were serious, we'd have to address the joint venture requirements. So my point would be, I've always thought the US is most effective if it works with its allies and partners on this with China. And so, yes, I think the nod towards TPP is in part a political gesture. But if we can push them to say these are the types of changes that you would need to make, I don't think one should close the door. Now, that's a long way from saying that they would come into TPP. And I frankly think, I would like to see the United States rejoin TPP. I think, as Barbara and others mentioned, I wouldn't see that in the near future until Trump or Biden deals with some of the politics. So frankly, I'd rather get the US into TPP before China gets into TPP. But I would also take one step further, which is that I've been struck that I think that as a function of some of the changes that I mentioned in centralization of policy, the Chinese diplomacy has moved to a greater bullying in economics and politics. We've seen this obviously with Australia, but we saw it with Korea as well. And you saw it with some of the Scandinavian countries. And it's a long list of countries that had sort of used its trade power in a very kind of offensive way. I frankly think that should be a subject for WTO discussions. Now, frankly, the United States doesn't have clean hands on this. So until we as a country sort of straighten out our trade policy, we're perhaps not the best one to be part of it. But this is the type of coalition effort that I hope the Biden administration will develop. And the reason I say hope is because, as I mentioned, I think there's a real need and opportunity to do this, but I'm concerned about the political priorities of the administration. Having said this, since you asked about, or some of you asked about at least the name about Catherine Tai out there, I think it's that's a good choice. She's Barbara Weisel and others would know Catherine better than I would, but by reputation, she is a very skilled trade lawyer, probably as important. She's got experience with the Congress. The challenge, if you look at our trade negotiators, is the job is more than being a trade lawyer. The job is basically to have some sense of strategy and coalition building with your domestic politics as well as international politics. And in the case of this administration, you really want somebody who will be an internal advocate, in a sense, a policy entrepreneur to build this new trade coalition. That's her opportunity, and we'll just have to see whether that comes to pass. I know from talking with some of the Republican senators that they weren't all happy with the Trump policies. There could be some opportunity here to pull together a new trade coalition. And so that'll be her challenge if she's confirmed, and I suspect she will be.
Okay, thank you for your answer, and thank you for the question, Mr. Ambassador. Let me now proceed with the list of questions that I have here. It's a shame that we can ask you only one question given the time constraint. So let me introduce one question here. So Mr. Zolik, in your recent interview, you mentioned that the world could look like it did in 1900 if there is no cooperation between countries. I believe this was an interview with BBC. So could you elaborate a little on this argument?
Yeah, what I was trying to bring to people's attention is that, the United States, as much by response to circumstances as any plan, created a system in 1947, 49, and then for 70 years beyond, there was a different type of alliance order. And South Korea became part of the military alliance, but there was also a key sort of economic arrangement. And we've all, at least until the Trump administration, people took a lot of those pieces for granted. And what I was trying to do with that comment was to say that we shouldn't take them for granted. The types of things that we're talking about in systemic reforms and efforts here are very important for the United States, but also for South Korea and others. And as I've seen over the past decades, it's important for South Korea and other important economies to see themselves as contributors to the health of the system. As I saw Korea did, for example, during the G20 process when I was at the World Bank. Because what the world, if we're unable to hold the system together, you would imagine much more of a sort of system of great powers with their sort of regional sort of hegemonies. China, India, the United States, the European Union in economic terms. I don't know if in political security terms. Japan would try to find a relationship between the United States and China. Korea would probably be in a similar position. Russia will have an influence because of its geography and its size and some of its energy issues. But that's a very different world than the world that we've all sort of worked in politically. So I was trying to prod people to recognize that the types of issues we've talked about, whether they be bilateral or WTO or World Bank and IMF, are not to be taken for granted. And my larger point here for Korea is that, it's a point I've made over the years. Korea has been a beneficiary of this system, in part because of the hard work of the Korean people and the suffering of the Korean people. So this is a testament to you and the way you've used the system. But it will also be important for you to recognize that there's ways you can contribute and help in the system. Not necessarily in the ways the Trump administration encouraged you to, but you got through that period and this is a new one. So as you think about your agenda going forward, reflect on these issues that I talked about: climate, data, some of the international economic institutions, biological security, because I think your political hand internationally will be stronger if you're seen as a contributor.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Zolik, for your valuable comments. We hope to see you again in the future.
I would look forward to it.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And before we end the session, as I mentioned earlier, let me invite Ms. Kathleen Stevens, President of Korea Economic Institute of America and former U.S. Ambassador to Republic of Korea. She is going to provide some thoughts on the Biden transition, which should be a valuable addition to the discussion we just had, I think. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome her with a big hand.
Well, good morning to everybody in Korea and good evening to my colleagues here in North America. At this point in the
Okay, Ms. Stevens, I think we are having some technical difficulties. The screen is frozen at the moment, so I think our technical team should be able to fix it pretty soon. So please bear with us, ladies and gentlemen. So I heard that there's an internet connection problem in the United States. So if you could bear with us for a while.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, you're back.
Well, let me start again just by saying I think at this point everything that I think can be said usefully for the moment has been well said by our speakers tonight. And I'm moving my cat now here because I'm thinking about how some of the themes that have come through tonight in terms of emphasizing what the Biden administration wants to do is the commitment to working with allies and partners, to deepening our dialogue, and to trying to overcome some of the limitations and constraints that we are under now, in particular, given the pandemic. And I think tonight's a good example of that. So I do want to thank very much the National Economic Advisory Council for leading this event, for working with us and KIEP and our partners here. And if I may, I also want to thank all who participated from the United States. Mr. Zellick, as always, has given us a great strategic vision and a lot to think about, and our panelists as well. I don't think we knew when we planned this that we were going to hear the announcement about the new USTR. So I have a sense that it's always good to say this is timely, but this is really timely. So, but this must continue. I think this is the kind of candor that, again, despite the constraints we're under, that we need. That's very much underpins the way in which the United States and Republic of Korea have worked through many challenging trade and economic issues over the decades. And I'm very encouraged by the conversation I've heard tonight for its candor and its vividness. So with that, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you again.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Stevens. So I believe that this marks the end of the first session. We'll now have a short break before moving on to the second session. So thank you very much.